Hello and welcome to the Sex Ed mini lecture series. Happy Pride Month. I am recording this in June of 2025. So excited to be able to tackle today's topic, especially during Pride Month, especially. Not always a part of the community that we talk about that broadly, but today we are going to talk about the connection between monogamy and agriculture. So we're going to talk a little bit about ethical non-monogamy and polyamory, but we're really going to focus mostly on the construction of monogamy and how that is tied to agriculture. And you might be like, monogamy and agriculture, how are those things connected? Let's dive in. Let's find out together. So, in order to do that, let's get to today's presentation. So, for those who have not visited before, I also wanted to do a quick nod to who I am so that you know a little bit more about my background. So, my name is Jules Purnell. My pronouns are they, them. I am a graduate of Wider University Center for Human Sexuality Studies. So, that's where I earned my master's degree. I also have a bachelor's in women and gender studies and sociology. Today's lecture, especially, is going to be very, very sociology heavy. So, buckle up if you're interested, especially in hearing a sociological perspective about the advent of monogamy. We're going to go there and we'll be tying in some pieces of anthropology and other fields of study as well. I'm also an ASEC certified sexuality educator. So if you're interested in having somebody come and speak to your organization or to your class, and you would like to have somebody who is affiliated with ASEC join you, please do hit me up. I'll share my contact information. And I also am able to give continuing education credits. So if that's something that you're interested in, likewise, please do reach out. I am a lecturer in sociology, and I have also worked as a lecturer in psychology as well. So this is a very, very mini version of a longer lecture that I normally give on this topic as part of my semester-long courses. I also do private consulting and public speaking. So if you're interested in having me come and do either something for your whole organization, or if you as an individual are really interested in talking about any of these subjects, please do reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to discuss. So, first of all, what is monogamy? What are we talking about? Monogamy is this concept of two people who are in an exclusive relationship with one another. And this has been suggested as kind of the end all be all. And this is what we think of when we hear people talk about so-called traditional marriage. I would argue, and many other people would argue, that this is not the traditional form of marriage or the way that people have organized their relationships. In fact, this figure that is being depicted here is Victoria Woodhull. She really argued against the problems within monogamy as she saw it, specifically for women in terms of monogamy. And she was a proponent of what was the so-called free love movement. So far, far beyond what we think of as hookup culture today, there have been people that have been advocating for an experience outside of this so-called traditional marriage, this idea that two people are partnered, usually in a heterosexual dyad, and that is romantically and sexually exclusive. Really, that's the whole point of monogamy. Yet that's not really how most human beings have organized their relationships throughout time. In fact, this kind of monogamy, as we understand it, has really only been practiced for about the last 1,000 years or so. In the form of marriage, as we think of it today, probably only in the last couple of hundred. Whereas Homo sapiens, our species, we've been around for quite a lot longer than that. So, what have we been doing this whole time otherwise? Let's talk about it. So, throughout time, many cultures, many peoples have practiced different ways of forming relationships, forming families, having children, sharing property, all these different things. Not all of them have included monogamy. Some of our oldest ancestors did not practice monogamy for facts. We know that a lot of people who were hunter-gatherer tribes did not practice monogamy in the way that we conceive of it today. And we'll talk about that in a little bit because we can look at existing modern hunter-gatherer tribes and what they're doing. We can take some clues about what our ancient ancestors were probably doing as well. A lot of the crux of monogamy, the whole point of it, was to be able to protect someone's wealth and property. So different royal families would merge with each other to be able to share their wealth with each other, to be able to preserve status and to share wealth. So that's where a lot of monogamy practices originated. This idea that if you especially had a lot of money or a lot of property, it was really important that you be able to pass it on to a specific heir. That way you could maintain a certain bloodline or a certain family lineage. That was really the preoccupation of people that had money, that had something at stake. Whereas for the common person, that wasn't that important. So, like I said before, the concept of modern marriage being practiced for just the layperson, the general John Q. public, that's really only been about the last like 150-ish or so years. The Victorian marriage culture, once it started to trickle down into the individual family, that was more about family mergers. That's where we hear, especially about things like a dowry, which is the idea that women, especially because they can't be employed, they're going to be a financial suck. So they have to be dowried off, right? Like we have to give whoever family she's going to live with some money so that they can basically take care of her. And so you can start to see how this already has a misogynistic bias. And a lot of people, myself included, argue that marriage, specifically in a heterosexual context, is really geared towards the disenfranchisement of women. And that's really what Victoria Woodhull argued as well, and why she said that we need to rethink marriage as it stands. And she advocated for the abolition of marriage, or at least a radical restructuring of marriage that included what she called free love, or the ability for women to choose their partners freely and not be so dependent upon men. There are a lot of people that also argue that once we started to be able to sell our labor in the labor market, so around the time of the advent of the Industrial Revolution, for example, a lot more people left their homes, left their traditional families, which maybe were farmers or they had some other family trade. So, for example, if your dad was the blacksmith, it was very likely that you were going to go on to become a blacksmith. A lot of that changed once we had the ability for people to go into the labor market and sell their labor for whatever they chose to do. That also meant that a lot more people were no longer tied to traditional expectations of their family arranging a marriage for them. People were leaving their small communities. So it was less likely that they were just going to marry whoever happened to live down the street or whoever they happened to have grown up around. So if you're moving to a bigger city because that's where the labor is, you're more likely to interact with people that you normally would not have seen in your hometown or in your community where your family lives. So that's where a lot more people were able to do different forms of labor, and this included women. So a lot more people had more economic choice in terms of what they did for creating a family. It was less tied to tradition and what people had normally been doing. So especially for women, if you have some money in your pocket, you can now invest in things like going out and being in public and meeting with a potential suitor. So that's where the advent of what we call dating started to appear, was when people were able to make a little bit more choice about who they wanted to be in a relationship with, who they wanted to marry. And there have been many thinkers that have argued both for and against this being a good thing. So, for example, the philosopher Michel Foucault has argued that this overabundance of choice has actually really confused the way that we engage in modern life and in reality. So this has shaken up the way that we have thought about our traditional path in life, which can be a good thing on the one hand, but it does over romanticize the idea that yes, the Industrial Revolution was a good thing and a positive thing. And I would argue that its antecedent, agriculture, actually set the stage for some of the problematic elements of what we see today in terms of modern relationships and monogamy. We also start to see this idea of romantic love, so-called companionate marriage. That starts to emerge around the 1800s. That's this idea that you get married to somebody that you want to life build with in a very specific way. So when you hear people say things like, my spouse is my best friend, that idea, that concept started to really take root around the 1800s. Before that, there wasn't this expectation that you would have emotional fulfillment in your marriage relationship. That's a nice bonus if you get it, but that wasn't the main reason for getting married. So the idea of, I want to have a spouse that will fulfill me emotionally, that will hold hands and watch the sunset together, we'll have common goals, all of that is actually a fairly new concept. Marriage used to be more interested in the preservation of wealth and the merger of well-to-do families. And for the common person, it was a way that if you had accumulated any savings or wealth to be able to pass it on to whatever your heirs were. So you can see this trajectory going down through time in terms of what marriage has been expected to do. And I would argue that today marriage has so much more pressure on it than ever before. And I think that has a lot to do with why we see declining marriage rates and why younger people especially are less and less interested in participating in marriage as we think about it today. So I started to talk a little bit about the difference between industrialization and then agrarian society. If you're not a sociology student, don't worry. We're going to talk about it here for a little bit. But basically, there used to be people, as we all have been on the planet, all Homo sapiens, mostly people traveled from place to place. We would follow whatever food source was available during a given season. And that changed with the advent of agriculture. So people could stay put, they could farm a specific plot of land and not have to chase food sources from one place to another. So that's the difference between nomadic societies and agrarian societies. So within nomadic societies, there was a lot more gender equity. And again, how do we know that? This was so long ago. There weren't people necessarily creating historical documents at that time. When we look at modern hunter-gatherer communities that still exist on this planet, we do tend to see better gender equity. What that basically means is that nomadic societies would follow a given food supply, and most of their food was vegetation. It was not necessarily meat-based. So, for a lot of communities, women were the ones who were mostly in charge of going out and harvesting different vegetation that the community would then eat, which means that women had more relative power within the culture and society. Why was it that women would be doing this? Well, when you think about the people that traditionally have been thought of as women, those are the folks that can get pregnant and can give birth. If you are either pregnant or you are nursing or you have a baby that is tied to your body, it's much easier to gather vegetation than it is to go off and chase after an animal that you have to then hunt down and kill. It's not to say that women didn't do that. There have always been women hunters, and there have always been men that were able to help with the vegetation production as well. So these things have not been as gender segregated as one might expect. And in fact, a lot of hunter-gatherer societies, the division of labor was a lot more loosey-goosey. So generally speaking, women were the ones that were harvesting vegetation. Generally speaking, men were the ones that were either hunting or finding scavenged remains of what another predator had killed. So, a tiger kills a hoofed animal, your family happens upon the remains. Woohoo, that's something you didn't have to hunt and kill. You just drag that back to your village. So, in terms of who was quote unquote bringing home the bacon, it was a lot more common for women to be the ones to produce what most of the community would be eating. Most of the calories people consumed were things that had been harvested this way. So, that's also something that's a rant for a whole other time in terms of how we think about vegetarianism versus who consumes meat and what that means about masculinity. I'm going to leave that one there for now. Within agrarian culture, people are starting to settle down. They're saying, I don't want to chase the food supply anymore. We're in a place of relative plenty where we can continue to produce food on a specific plot of land throughout the year. And then when we're no longer able to harvest, we can take what's there and put it in a grain silo or put it somewhere aside where it will be kept safe. And we can accumulate this to get us through whatever season we're not going to be growing. So the winter in the north, for example. So when we start to have more stuff than we need because we're saving it up, that is what we in the sociological world call surplus. Anytime that you start to accumulate surplus, it means that you have more stuff than you actually need in a given moment. People that are able to accumulate more surplus than they need in the immediate moment, and then more and more and more and more and more. This is where we start to get the concept of wealth and private property. So if you're accumulating a whole bunch of grain, for example, then you have a vested interest in making sure that animals aren't getting into it, so mice aren't getting into your grain stores. You also now have vested interest in making sure that your neighbor doesn't steal it. So this is where we get the advent of the concept of private property. I have something I don't want my neighbors to get to. Hang on to that thought for just a second. So, if you have a whole bunch of stuff that you're trying to keep other people away from, that's where we get the concept of theft, right? Like, I have stuff, I don't want you to steal it, keep away from my stuff. This is where we start to get really, really early vestigial laws and practices where people are now criminalizing behaviors that before didn't really exist because there was no need for that specific law or that specific act wasn't considered criminal. If you needed something, you might take it because you're in a communal situation where one family is not hoarding a whole bunch of stuff. You're all kind of sharing everything together. So you can see how agriculture starts to set the stage for what will eventually become concepts like capitalism. So again, concept of property leads to the concept of law. This also means that if you have a whole bunch of stuff and you want to leave it to someone, it is in your best interest to leave it to whoever your paternal relation is. So if you are a man who, for example, has a wife or multiple wives, you want to make sure that whoever your stuff goes to is someone that you are related to. Suddenly paternity becomes really important. It's important to know who are your kids, who are your genetically related offspring. That didn't used to matter before. In fact, in a lot of hunter-gatherer cultures, it's very common for everyone to have a vested interest in taking care of each other's kids. So the concept of these are my kids and I'm leaving them my stuff, that's a relatively new concept in the world of human beings. Before there was a co-parenting kind of experience, there are some cultures who believed that if a woman had sex with multiple men, each of those men contributed to the paternity of her children. So there was a lot more shared responsibility in terms of parenting and a lot less prohibition against women having multiple male sex partners, especially. So now we're in a situation where if you are somebody who is a man and you're interested in leaving your surplus to whoever your heir is, you have a more vested interest in controlling who your female partner has sex with and doesn't, which is where the concept of monogamy comes into play. So I have stuff. I don't want to leave it to just anybody. I want to make sure it's my kid, so I have to make sure that my wife is not having sex with any other men so that no other men's heirs are inheriting my stuff. So this is where this starts to get into what we think of as monogamy. Now, here's where it gets interesting because, again, if you are a man and you have multiple wives that are all having your children, that means that you have more heirs, more potential heirs, especially at a time when infant mortality is really high. It's pretty common for people to have a lot of kids because they know that not all of them are going to survive into adulthood. So the more male heirs you have, especially, that means it's more likely that you're going to have someone that you can give your stuff to who is not going to have it given away in a dowry. Because again, remember, in this kind of a system where dowry is important, women are seen as a liability. They're seen as a financial drain. So being able to give your stuff to a male heir means that you're secure in the idea that your wealth is going to get passed down to the person that you intend it to go to. So having multiple wives is also a sign of having enough wealth to be able to distribute to multiple heirs. It's also a sign of virility, right? Like if you're a man and you're able to get multiple women pregnant and they all have your children, that's a sign of status. That's a sign of status to be able to have multiple wives to begin with, because it means that you have enough surplus that you can have multiple wives who are essentially ornamental and producing heirs for you. So you can start to see where patriarchy starts to form here, where the importance of men starts to become outsized within the family, but also within culture and society. In the church, this becomes important because there are a lot of men who go into the church and they take a vow of celibacy. What happens to their stuff? It goes back to the church. So, this is where the idea of priests not being able to have wives and be able to marry becomes important because the church wants all that wealth to go back to them. So, this is the reason why not only is monogamy being practiced among lay people, but men of the cloth are now also being encouraged to not have relationships with women at all so that their wealth goes right back to the church. So all of this stuff basically stems from the concept of surplus, which is tied to the concept of agriculture. Wild. So I've alluded to this a few times. How do we know what ancient hunter-gatherer societies were doing? We can look at some modern hunter-gatherer societies that still exist on this planet to get a sense of what's happening. So the Kung tribe in sub-Saharan Africa, they have been studied pretty extensively since about the 1970s, specifically because they are a group that has some of the best gender equity of any people on the planet, and they are a hunter-gatherer society. They tend to co-parent with each other. So the paternity of children is not the primary driver in who takes care of a child and who doesn't. So it's not uncommon for wives and husbands to sit around together and share child rearing responsibilities. It's also not uncommon, as is pictured in this image, for people to kind of be grouped together in small family huddles that may or may not be genetically related to each other. So this image is probably the way that most human beings have spent our time on the planet going back that 160,000 something years. This is probably what we've been up to most of the time. This idea of the nuclear family, that's the newer advent. That's the thing that's the non-traditional marriage. This is the traditional marriage right here. The Akun tribe also tends to be matrifocal. What I mean by that is that women tend to be valued within their culture and society. They tend to be the ones that help to shape laws and to have a say in how the culture and society is run. Whereas patriarchy, again, is the idea that to be a man in a culture and society means you have this outsized place of importance. That's not so much important for this tribal community because, again, there's not this stranglehold on we have to maintain surplus and pass it on to my male heir. That concept doesn't really exist here. The role of child rearing is differs than the way it does in the West. So in the West, there's this idea, and this is changing, but still the idea that being the birth-giving parent and staying home and taking care of the children and all of that should fall on the shoulders of women, that the woman's place is in the home. That's something that's really a modern Western concept that hasn't existed in a lot of hunter-gatherer communities. It's been more diffused in terms of the responsibility for who does what. It also means that there's a decrease in violence. And one of the reasons is frankly just the structure of the dwellings in these communities. So you can see in the background there's a hut. The way that the huts are set up is they're all kind of in a ring and they're facing each other so that everyone can see into everybody else's individual dwelling. So if somebody is having a fight with their spouse, it's more likely that other people in the community will see it and will actually intervene and say, like, hey, can you guys take a break from each other? They also have fewer instances of things like child abuse. So these are communities that are very, very tightly knit, where people tend to take care of and show up for each other more because there's a vested interest in maintaining harmony in the entire village. It's also extremely common for people to marry and then remarry and remarry and remarry, which does seem to follow some of the trends that we see in biology as well. So, for example, it's perfectly acceptable for a woman in this community to decide that she doesn't want to be with her husband anymore and for them to annul that marriage and then for her to remarry. So that's not seen as taboo in the same way that it is in other places. So this is probably pretty close to what we think of as serial monogamy in the West, which is what we tend to practice nowadays more popularly than any other form of like true monogamy. True monogamy means one mate for life, that's it. So I'm thinking of like swans and prairie dogs and these animals that have one mate for life, and that's the total of who they procreate with. For human beings, it's a little bit different. So even for people that are married, a lot of times they'll be married for say 5 to 7 years, they'll get divorced, they might take a time of grieving, but then they'll get back into dating again and then marry somebody else potentially. So the idea of serial monogamy is actually pretty popular within the human species, and it seems to map onto what we have been up to this whole time. So the idea of you find your high school sweetheart, you get married, you stay with them forever, it kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm going to go ahead and take us out of share here too to kind of wrap us up. So, the idea of one mate for life, this form of monogamy, is something that's extremely artificial to the human species. It's always been more common for us to have multiple relationships. For some, those relationships overlap. So, especially in some of these more tribal communities, it's very popular and possible to have multiple relationships that maybe even overlap slightly, and for everyone to still co-parent with each other, to still exist in these small communities together, which we're seeing replicated in the way that some people are doing things like polyamory or adoption of other people's kids and co-parenting together with maybe somebody who has kids from a previous relationship. So all of these things that have been demonized and have been the so-called fall of humanity, actually, I see it as a rewilding. It's us returning to who we actually have been meant to be this entire time. So, if you've enjoyed this discussion and you want to learn a little bit more about non-monogamy or monogamy and agricultural practices, please feel free to reach out and I will be including some of my contact information below. Thanks again for spending time with me here during one of our Sex Ed mini lecture series, and I hope to see you next time.